Welcome to Work Outcomes in Self-Employed Cancer Survivors. We're glad you're here. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Project Manager with the Work Wellness and Disability Prevention Institute, and I'll be co-moderating the webinar today. This webinar is co-hosted with Cancer and Work and is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC Government, as well as donations and memberships to WWDPI. We thank our program partners, Pain BC, Sport Chronic Pain Network, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work Education Advisory Committee, and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow the presentation with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week, along with the slides. You will be emailed the direct links for all of these items when they're available. Today's webinar is co-moderated by Maureen Parkinson, who will introduce our presenter, and Dr. Lucy Kutzum, who will be running the Q&A session. Maureen Parkinson is the province-wide vocational rehabilitation counselor at the BC Cancer and co-director of Cancer and Work. Dr. Lucy Kutzum is a core team member of the Cancer and Work Research Group and an associate professor in industrial organizational psychology at St. Mary's University. And now I will hand it over to Maureen.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to represent Cancer and Work. Cancerandwork.ca is a website that provides comprehensive information and resources to cancer patients and survivors, healthcare providers, and employers to support cancer survivors with remaining, returning, and finding new work. Our speaker today is Dr. Linda Sharp, who's a professor of cancer epidemiology at Newcastle University in the UK. She's been conducting research on cancer survivorship for more than 12 years. Workforce participation after cancer diagnosis is one of her major interests, and she's led a range of qualitative epidemiological and economic studies which have examined different aspects of this issue and has published widely on this topic. She is a leading member of the EU Cancer and Work Network, CANWAN. Several years ago, she observed that people who were self-employed at the time of cancer diagnosis were very much more likely than salaried survivors to continue working following diagnosis. This stimulated her research in the topic of today's webinar, in which she will present her original work, findings from other international studies, and work done with the CANWAN on the impact of cancer on the working lives of those self-employed. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Maureen. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. It's very nice to speak to you today. As Maureen said, I'm going to talk to you about the state of the evidence on working after cancer among the self-employed. This is an outline of what I propose to cover during the webinar. Just to set the scene, and I will give you some context about cancer and its incidence in working age adults. I'll talk a little about work participation after cancer generally, just touching very lightly on what typically happens to cancer survivors who were working at diagnosis, which work outcomes are adversely affected by cancer, and the risk factors for workforce non-participation in survivors. I'll then make a few points about why it's important that people who have cancer engage in the workforce after their diagnosis to the extent to which they wish to do. I'll then talk a little bit about self-employment as a sector of the economy, and then move on to the work that we've been doing in CANWAN around work-related outcomes after cancer in the self-employed. After covering that, I'll talk to you a bit about the gaps in evidence and practice say something about the challenges of conducting research in this group, and something about, to get you thinking about how we might develop interventions or strategies to support work engagement after cancer in the self-employed. And I'll make a few final conclusions. So, cancer in working age adults. Typically in developed countries, around 36 to 40% of cancers are diagnosed in people aged under 65. And then there's another 15% or so diagnosed in the 65 to 69 age group. This is just some data from the United Kingdom on the distribution of cancer incidence by age. And it's just to show you a typical pattern. In men, you can see these are the under 65, so around about 31% of cancers are in this age group. In women, slightly more, 40%. And then you can see in this age group, the older workers in our economies, we have that additional 12 to 16%. People are increasingly likely to be diagnosed with cancer during their working years. And this is because in many health systems, we're putting more emphasis on screening and early detection. And screening typically happens in those who are around 50 years of age, so are still very much in the workforce. We also have, in most developed countries, a rising retirement age. Indeed, in the United Kingdom, only 2 weeks ago, the statutory retirement age for women increased from 60 to 65, and for both men and women it's going up to 66 next year, and we anticipate it'll continue to rise after that. So that means there are just more and more people, cancers diagnosed in people of working age. At the same time, cancer survival is improving. The graphs down the side, you don't need to pay attention to the details, it's just to show you the upward trends. And so let's look at the blue lines. And this is 5-year survival from the cancers diagnosed in the early 1970s to cancers diagnosed around 5 or 6 years ago. And you can see that steady upward trend in survival. 5-year survival increasing from around 30% to almost 60% over that time. And for many of the common cancers, survival's highest in middle age. So as well as more and more people being diagnosed with a cancer of working age, more and more people of working age are living longer after a diagnosis of cancer. And that means there are a growing number of cancer survivors in the population. In the United Kingdom at the moment, where our population is 60 million, we estimate that there are more than 2 million people living with and beyond a cancer, and almost 1 million people living with a cancer who are under 65 years of age. We project that the number of survivors is going to grow dramatically over time. These are estimates made in 2012, and this is where we are currently. We think we've got, as I said, just over 2 million cancer survivors. We'll be up at 3 million by 2020, 4 million by 2030, and 5 million by 2040. These figures themselves are not particularly important if you're outside of the UK, but that it's worth knowing that this general trend is what we're seeing across developed countries. So we have more and more people living in the population after a diagnosis of cancer. We also have the fact that people are living better after a cancer diagnosis. Over the past years in cancer treatment, as well as advances in the types of treatment we have, I think there's been greater recognition of the importance of treatment toxicities and side effects, and then more attention paid to helping people manage and cope and deal with those. And there's a lot more focus on supportive care, on rehabilitation and holistic aspects of well-being. And all of this is focused on helping people to live better after cancer. And part of living better after cancer involves returning to usual activities, including work. And I guess that's the major rationale why many of us are interested in researching this topic. So I'm going to just cover broadly typical patterns of work participation after cancer before I get into looking at the contrast between the self-employed and salaried survivors. So this slide is based on a series of studies that I ran when I worked in Ireland, and it's on a bunch of different cancers. The particular cancers are not so important. It's just to give you a bit of a summary of generally what the evidence says, and there's nothing particular about Ireland here. It's the findings that I'm going to show you are pretty typical for most developed countries. So we find that maybe around about 20% of survivors who were working at the time of diagnosis will try to continue working with minimal time off. And then we have the remainder, around about 80%, who will typically take a period of time away from work. If we look at the 1 year point, of those who took time away from work, about half of them have usually returned to work. Some will be doing their previous hours, some will have reduced their working hours. Some will have retired. The interesting thing is that often those who've retired feel that wasn't necessarily a choice they would have wanted to make, and there are many strands of evidence across different countries that suggest that people feel that they've been forced into retirement against what would have been their own wishes. And then we tend to have about another third or so of people who end up on more extended sick leave. In the Cancer and Work Network, we've been doing a systematic review and meta-analysis to look at longer term outcomes in cancer survivors who were working at the time of diagnosis. So this is a summary of the studies that have looked at return to work after 2 years or more following a cancer diagnosis. And these are studies from many different countries, largely Europe and North America, and they include a range of different cancers. And this percentage is the percentage who are back at work 2 years or more after diagnosis. You can see the variability in the estimates, but overall, if you pool them, you have a pooled estimate of 0.73. So 73% of survivors who were working at the time of diagnosis have returned to work by 2 years or more. The I-squared statistics here tells us what we can simply see ourselves, that there's significant heterogeneity in these patterns. One of the other main work-related outcomes that cancer affects is workability and functioning. And I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about it because it becomes pertinent again later in the presentation. And there are a range of studies of cancer survivors who've returned to work, and they show that they often have significantly poorer workability and work functioning than people in the workforce without cancer. This is data from the United States, from Kathy Bradley's group, and it's the percentage of working survivors who reported a physical disability or a cognitive disability at 12 months in the blue bars and at 18 months in the orange bars after their diagnosis. This is data from women with breast cancer. And you can see in terms of physical disabilities, of those who were back at work, 60% of them reported a physical disability at 12 months due to the cancer. That had declined by 18 months, but was still a significant proportion of the women who were back at work, 36%. Cognitive disabilities were also common, although not as common, a third reporting them at 12 months and 22% at 8 months. This review from Doets and colleagues in the Netherlands talks about cognitive limitations, coping issues, fatigue, depression and anxiety, all influencing workability. They also talk about physical problems, such as difficulties with lifting and treatment-induced menopausal symptoms affecting functioning. So these limitations in workability and functioning are common, even when people make it back to work. But these are not the only work-related outcomes that cancer affects. I'm not going to talk about any of these in any detail, but it's just to make sure that you're aware of them. Cancer survivors are much more likely to be unemployed than people who don't have cancer. Survivors often report changes in their roles and responsibilities and other work duties. Now, sometimes those changes can be positive because they can be about accommodations or adaptations in the workforce, in the workplace, to help people cope and to live with cancer. But often they're unwanted changes, and those are the ones we need to be concerned about. I've mentioned already unwanted early retirement, and as I said, we see that across a number of different settings. In the past, in the 1980s in particular, we saw a lot of reports of discrimination and problems with people losing their jobs or experiencing discrimination at work because of cancer. I think that's probably less common nowadays with the legal frameworks that we have in place that largely prevent discrimination at work. But I wouldn't like to say it's not happening. There are still reports from some settings where people describe this happening. Survivors often talk about cancer affecting their ability to change employers or to find re-employment, and are concerned about the issues of perhaps having to disclose a cancer to a new employer and the reactions that the employer might have. Cancer can also affect quality of working life and can have a negative impact on the work environment or the work climate. And I've just put some references at the bottom for those of you who might be interested in some of these areas. I thought it would be useful just to summarise what we think we might know about the patient, the disease-related factors and the job-related factors that are associated with work resumption or work participation after a cancer diagnosis. And what this slide does is summarises those factors from a range of systematic and comprehensive reviews in this area, right back from 2002 onwards, right up to a very recent colorectal cancer review that I was involved in, which is currently in press. And you can see there are a whole range of factors that have been associated with work resumption. At the patient end, we have factors like age and gender, educational level, whether somebody is a member of a trade union, and their level of commitment to the work organisation. There are a range of disease-related factors, cancer site, so where the cancer has presented, the extent of surgery, whether somebody has had chemotherapy, whether they might have had cancer-related treatments, symptoms of and side effects of cancer treatment like fatigue or depression. And in terms of the job that somebody does, things that have been reported as being associated with work participation are physical effort, working hours, duration of work absence, employers' attitudes, social climate at work. So all of these factors have been reported. But the interesting thing when you bring these systematic reviews together is even though we've seen an explosion in evidence in this area over the past 10 years, we still have a lot of uncertainties. And what I've actually shown you here in colours other than white are the factors where we have a little more confidence that they're reasonably consistently associated with work participation or work resumption, and everything I've left in white we've maybe seen in a small number of studies, or we've seen inconsistent findings across studies. So where we think we're quite clear is we know that work participation varies by cancer site, extent of surgery and chemotherapy, perhaps by disease stage, but we don't know how much that's confounded by these other factors. Physical effort of the job is important, and those who have jobs that require physical effort are much less likely to resume working. And I've also shaded here in green for you self-employment, because I hope I'll convince you by the end of this webinar that there is some evidence that the self-employed have different work-related outcomes. What's worth noting, though, and we brought this out in a commentary paper that we wrote as part of the Cancer and Work Network and published last year in the European Journal of Cancer Care, is that really thinking about the self-employed as a group of cancer survivors, they're very much a neglected group. If we look at generally the evidence base on work-related outcomes after cancer that I've been summarising for you, the majority of studies are limited to salaried workers or basically employees. Most papers, when you look at them, do not mention the self-employed at all. You often can't work out whether there was anybody who was self-employed who was included in the study. Occasionally you will see that the self-employed were explicitly excluded. If they have been included in a study, usually there'll be quite a small group of participants, and often they won't be presented separately from salaried workers. Their findings will just be combined with those for salaried workers. And what I'm hoping to convince you is that that's an inappropriate thing to do, that we really need to be separating out the self-employed and understanding their experiences and their needs and their outcomes so that we can work out how best to support them. And probably the worst thing we can do is simply to just combine them with salaried workers and assume that everything is the same. The reality at the moment is, though, that we know relatively little about work-related outcomes after cancer amongst the self-employed. So why is work participation important after cancer? I've got a couple of points I just want to make here. We've known for a long time that it's important to survivors and families because returning to work demonstrates a measure of control over cancer. It helps restore a sense of normalcy. It enhances self-esteem and quality of life, and it provides social support. These are all positive aspects of returning to work after cancer. And getting back to the workplace generally represents an important step on the path to recovery. It's also important because most people work because of financial necessity. Even those of us who enjoy our jobs are generally working because we need to. We need to pay our bills in order to be able to live. We've done a series of studies where we look at the financial consequences of time away from work due to cancer and the fact that that can lead to a reduced household income. You can then have additional cancer-related expenses, and those together can lead to cancer-related financial hardship. And now, in a series of different studies, we've shown associations between that cancer-related financial hardship and poorer psychological well-being and quality of life in cancer survivors. So I would contend that for patients and their families, return to work is not only an important step on the path to recovery, it's also important because it minimises loss of income and consequent financial and emotional stress and strain. Returning to work after cancer is also important from a society perspective because every member of the workforce contributes to the gross domestic product of the country. Each of us have a certain work capacity in our life, and as we work, we're contributing to the wealth of the country. And any time out of the workforce, whether that's temporarily or permanently because of cancer, represents a major economic loss to society. And I've done a number of studies in this area, so I'll just give you a couple of highlights from them. This is a study where we estimated the productivity costs, so it's the average cost of lost productivity due to cancer-related premature mortality. So that's cancer deaths in people of working age, and a cancer death in somebody under 65 of working age we would count as a premature death. If somebody dies from cancer in that age group, it means they cannot be working, they cannot be contributing to society and to the gross domestic product, and we can estimate the cost of those losses. And we estimated in Europe in 2008, the cost of those losses was 75 billion. So per premature cancer death, more than 219,000 euros cost in lost productivity. We can inflate these to 2007 equivalents, so 84 billion euros across Europe in lost productivity, and almost €250,000 average lost productivity costs per cancer death. If we look at that as a percentage of gross domestic product, it's 0.6% of the European gross domestic product. And that percentage varies across Europe, and it's actually higher in the Southeast European countries. This percentage is a similar magnitude to other countries. Kathy Bradley published work in 2008 estimating the lost productivity cost in the United States and estimated that due to cancer and estimated that that was almost 1% of GDP. It's also worth thinking about these costs in terms of multiples of the average wage. So in the UK, it's for each death due to cancer in somebody under 65, the lost cost is about 6 to 7 times the average wage. So this is a substantial loss to the economy. And these premature mortality costs are not the only productivity cost due to cancer. There are a range of other costs, so costs of early retirement, temporary work absence, so time off work because of cancer, reduced working hours because of cancer, or inability to function well when at work, so presenteeism due to cancer. This means that the total costs of cancer-related lost productivity in Europe are much higher than 75 billion per year. And it's likely that in most developed economies, they're much more than 1% of GDP. So these are the reasons that it's important to restore people to their desired level of economic activity after being diagnosed with cancer. But my question for you is that possible for the self-employed? What we want people to do is to return to work at a pace and a rate and an extent that's appropriate for them and their health, but that's very challenging for the self-employed. They're constantly on this seesaw trying to balance their cancer recovery and rehabilitation with keeping their business running. So I'm going to move now to talk about self-employed as a sector of the economy. There are growing importance as a sector of the economy, and they've become a priority in contemporary economies worldwide. We can look at the Europe 2020 report. It's a strategy for jobs and growth, and it promotes self-employment and encourages member states to promote self-employment and also to remove measures that discourage self-employment. The self-employed are seen as entrepreneurial, flexible, and adapting quickly to changing circumstances. They create and provide jobs for others, and they're reckoned to be an important contributor to labour market recovery following the last major financial crisis. So they're seen as a key enabler of sustained economic growth, and that's why there's so much focus in promoting self-employment. These are data from the European Union, and I apologise for the quality of this slide. It's not reproduced very well, but it's to show you the variation in the proportion of self-employed in different European economies. In Europe as a whole, it's about 14% of the workforce are self-employed, and that ranges from around 7% in Norway to 30% in Greece. There are striking trends in self-employment across different European countries. If we can look at the Netherlands here in turquoise, they've seen self-employment grow in importance over time, as have the United Kingdom. Things have been quite stable here in Sweden, a little bit of a decline in Poland, and stable in other countries. But there are certainly countries in Europe where self-employment is growing as a sector of the economy. And you can see this also. This is data from Eurostat. This is the percentage change in salaried and self-employed jobs in selected European countries. So the self-employed jobs are in these grey bars and the jobs for salaried employees in the orange bars. And you can see in all of these countries here at this side of the graph, there have been a larger percentage growth in self-employed jobs in the economy than in salaried worker jobs in the economy. So what are the advantages of self-employment? You have independence, freedom and autonomy over type of work, pace and scheduling. That provides greater opportunities to achieve a work-life balance. And generally, self-employed workers have greater job satisfaction than salaried workers. They have better quality of life and physical and mental health than salaried workers. And that point I will ask you to remember because we'll come back to it. And some self-employed groups have lower mortality rates than salaried workers. But there are many disadvantages of self-employment. Often, self-employed people are low paid. They do heavy manual work with long, irregular hours. Increasingly, many people feel forced into self-employment because of a lack of salaried jobs. Increasingly, many self-employed people are providing goods or services for a single client on whom they depend for activity and income. So they're just like an employee, but they don't have any of the benefits of being an employee or any of the protections. Often, self-employed people work in high-risk sectors like agriculture and construction, and they're outside the scope of union and other health and safety at work protections. So there's a greater risk of work-related injuries and diseases, and there are higher rates of exhaustion and stress. And those who have contractors have risks of reputational threats and contractor betrayal. So there are many different types of self-employment. These are data for the European Union again, and there about 23% of the self-employed in the European Union employ others, and about 26% are stable own account workers. And it's considered that these are the people who've probably chosen to be self-employed. There are about a quarter of people who are small traders and farmers. And that's quite a variable group. And then there's perhaps another quarter that are these more vulnerable or concealed self-employed individuals. So people who effectively are in very vulnerable parts of the economy with very vulnerable self-employment and who may be reliant on a single client for all of their business. Income amongst the self-employed is volatile, and importantly, if you look at Europe, it's been falling in several European countries over the past decade. And social welfare entitlements are important. They're generally poorer than for salaried workers. So I'm going to give you two examples. So in the United Kingdom, salaried workers, if they're absent from work due to ill health, are entitled to statutory sick pay, so a state benefit. It's not especially high, but everybody is entitled to it. Many salaried workers also receive contractual sick pay from their employer, and for some, that will return their wages for a certain amount of time to the same level as it would have been when they were in work. The self-employed, by contrast, they may get a very low level of sickness benefit, but that's only if they have paid sufficient national insurance contributions, and the majority of self-employed workers have not paid those contributions because they're not mandatory. You can look at other countries like Norway, where you have much better levels of compensation generally for salaried workers. They're granted sick leave from day one for 1 year. And the compensation they receive is equivalent to their regular salary, so they have no lost income. In contrast, the self-employed have sick leave from day 17, so they lose those first 16 days, and the compensation is a maximum 66% of their past income. Now, I ask you to remember the situation in Norway because the self-employed actually do very well in terms of compensation in Norway, and I'm going to come back to some research that's been happening in Norway later. So I'm going to talk to you now about work-related outcomes after cancer in the self-employed. So As Maureen said in the introduction, I got into this area because of work that I did in Ireland. I did a survey of breast and prostate cancer survivors in Ireland who were working at the time of diagnosis. And I looked at the percentage who continued working and took no time off work, and found that 18% of survivors took no time off work. And I was surprised at what a high rate that was. And when I dug into it a little further, I found 4 factors that were associated in multivariable analysis with continuing to work. And the striking one was self-employed. I found over 1/3 of the self-employed took no time away from work, compared to only 13% of the salaried workers. So the self-employed were about 2.5 times more likely to continue working after a cancer diagnosis than salaried workers. This was intriguing, and perhaps I thought might be to do with the greater flexibility that self-employment gives you, but there could be other less positive reasons. And these started to be suggested when I looked in more detail at the data. So this is from the same survey, and this is the length of sickness absence amongst those who took time off after diagnosis and who had resumed working. So in salaried workers, on average, they were absent from work for 34 weeks after their cancer diagnosis. The self-employed were absent for only 17 weeks. So the self-employed were more likely to continue working, and if they took time off, were more likely to be back at work quickly. The interesting thing about this is that normally we think it's good if people are supported to continue working, but the later data I'll show you suggests that this is not entirely positive. We think that what's going on here is that the demands of the business mean that the self-employed feel they cannot afford that time away from work because their business will suffer. When we looked in this survey at the percentage who'd received any sick pay when absent from work, salaried workers, 2/3 of us told us they had had sickness pay, and only 6% of the self-employed. And when we asked whether finances had affected decisions on whether to take time off work following cancer, amongst the salaried, 18% told us that that had happened. But in the self-employed, 50% of them told us that finances had influenced their decisions about whether to take time off work. We also did some qualitative research as part of this study. We interviewed oncology social workers. So they're social workers who work in hospitals and work in oncology departments. We did interviews with breast and prostate cancer survivors and interviews with colorectal cancer survivors. Now, our main focus here was not to look at self-employment. The findings to do with self-employment just emerged as when we spoke to people about their experiences. The social workers talked about the self-employed patients being a potentially vulnerable group financially because they may not have sufficient social insurance contributions to be entitled to benefits. The self-employed survivors talked about pressure to continue working regardless of their health, even though they might find it difficult to cope. More positively, they often described help and support from family to keep business running. I'm just going to show you a couple of quotes from these studies. One was from a man with colorectal cancer, and he said for about 10 years he was self-employed, and all he was doing was subcontracting. So he was working for one big employer. And he was a little tradesman, and he was running around working all day, and he said he'd paid his social insurance contributions. But when it came to him needing sickness benefit, he was told no, he could get nothing. Another survivor told us that this was the time with his business. He got behind, things fell behind, and he wasn't on top of his accounts. He was only half functioning, and it took a while, and then he ended up in problems with his business. So this is building up this picture again of this challenge between balancing health and balancing the needs of the business. So this got us interested in what other research is out there, and there are 2 seminal papers from Canada that I thought it would be interesting to show you that have very similar themes. Both of them are in breast cancer. So the first one was a retrospective study of breast cancer survivors who were working at diagnosis, 567 of them, of whom 86 were self-employed. There were also a group of women in this study who didn't have cancer. And the study looked at work absences in the first year. So work absences of 4 weeks or more. The breast cancer survivors had on average 1.1 absence, and the duration was 5.6 months. And the group without cancer had on average 1 absence with a duration of 1.7 months. So as we'd expect, the breast cancer survivors had slightly more absences but of much longer duration. The interesting thing comes when we look within the group of breast cancer survivors about the patterns of absences. So in this analysis, they did a multivariable analysis, and they combined the variables of whether somebody was a union member or not a union member, and whether they were employed or salaried. And the self-employed, by definition, were not union members. So if you look at the mean length of absence due to cancer, longest 7.7 months in salaried union members, slightly shorter in salaried non-union members, and shorter again in the self-employed. And if you just look at the risk of a work absence of 4 weeks or more due to cancer compared to salaried union members, 4.41 times less likely the self-employed to be absent for 4 weeks or more. This is the second Canadian study, and it looks at lost income. This one was a prospective cohort study among breast cancer survivors. They were followed for 12 months. They took part in 3 interviews. 459 survivors were included in the analysis, of whom 73 were self-employed. And the authors found that on average, 58% of the wages of these women were compensated during their work absence. But when they looked in detail, the salaried workers had 64% of their wages compensated, but the self-employed only had 20% of their wages compensated. So again, we see this issue of lost income in the self-employed. So the authors worked out, on average, how much income women lost on their projected annual wages. On average, it was 27%. For the salaried workers, that worked out as 24% of their average income was lost due to work absences because of their cancer. For the self-employed, it was 41% of the income lost. So these findings were very similar to what we were seeing in Ireland. There's also data from France, which shows a very strong association between risk of business failure amongst those who have cancer. So the hazard ratio for the risk of a business failing amongst the self-employed and small business owners who've got cancer compared to those who don't have cancer, if you look up to the period of 5 years post-diagnosis, those with cancer have a 1.59 increased risk of their business failing. So a 60% higher risk of their business failing in the 5 years after the diagnosis of cancer compared to people without cancer. That risk increases beyond 5 years. The effect is very much attenuated, but it's still there. So I'm now going to talk to you about a study that's in press that we did on the CanWorm network. So several of us were interested in this idea of cancer and self-employment, and we thought we would try to bring together multiple data sets from different European countries to look really at work-related outcomes after cancer in self-employed people compared to salaried survivors. So we looked for all the data sets we could find, and we came up with 11 studies from 7 European countries, from Belgium, France, Finland, Ireland, Netherlands, Norway, and the UK. All of these were cross-sectional studies, and they provided data on work outcomes in self-employed and salaried cancer survivors who were working at the time of diagnosis. I'm not going to take you through this table in any detail, but suffice to say it's a summary of the characteristics of self-employment in the participating countries. There's a lot of variation in the proportion of self-employed and the part of the economy that they work in. In most countries, the self-employed on average earn less than salaried workers. Generally, they work longer hours, and generally a greater proportion are men. These are a summary of the studies, and again, I'm not going to take you through them. The important thing is that they were all cross-sectional, there was no longitudinal data available, and the largest studies had only just over 200 self-employed survivors in them. So although this is the biggest collation of data available, it still doesn't include a large number of self-employed survivors. We looked at a range of different outcomes. I'm going to tell you first of all about the warnings about this. We brought together data from all of these studies. We didn't put it in a pooled analysis because the studies were not designed to be compared and combined. So not all of outcomes were considered in all studies, and the outcomes were assessed in different ways in different studies. So our analyses were largely descriptive. So we compared. In each study, we said, amongst those working at diagnosis compared to salaried survivors, self-employed survivors were less often working at the time of the survey, and they less often received pension. And that was seen in at least 2 countries. They more often reported occupational changes since diagnosis. They less often took time off work, and they took less time off work on average than salaried survivors. They less often received financial compensation, and they more often reported negative financial changes. When we looked at survivors who were back at work, the self-employed ones compared to the salaried ones worked more hours and had more often had reduced their working hours since diagnosis. So they'd had to cut their working hours, but they were still working more hours than salaried survivors. And when we looked at workability and quality of life, the self-employed more often reported physical job demands, they had lower workability, they had lower work-related quality of life, and they had poorer mental quality of life or worse health-related quality of life. But importantly, these patterns were not consistent, so we need to try and understand them a bit more. The conclusion of this work is that the self-employed and salaried survivors differ in terms of labour market and other work-related outcomes, but the patterns of that difference varies between countries. Generally, the self-employed work more hours than salaried survivors, and this pattern's maintained when they get cancer. They still work more hours after cancer. It's clear across a range of countries that sick leave is less common amongst the self-employed, and they less often receive financial compensation. And what was clear in this study was that the length of sick leave was shorter in countries where financial compensation was worst, and it was longer in countries where it was better. So countries like Norway, where financial compensation was better, the self-employed took longer periods of sick leave. There wasn't a clear pattern of better workability and work-related quality of life amongst the self-employed cancer survivors, and that was different from the population as a whole. You'll remember I said to you at the beginning, generally, the self-employed have better workability, greater job satisfaction, and better work-related quality of life. We didn't see that here in cancer survivors. And in further multivariable analysis in Norway, among the self-employed, self-employment was associated with significantly lower overall health, quality of life, and workability. And what it looks like is that amongst the self-employed, the cancer affects working hours are reduced, that affects financial changes, so someone experiences negative financial changes, and that is impacting on their work ability and how they judge and perceive their work ability and their quality of life. What this suggests generally is there's a trade-off between business and health, and that trade-off favours business. I'm going to just say a little bit about a new paper that we have in preparation. My colleague Stefan Torp in Norway is leading this paper, and it's qualitative research with self-employed cancer survivors and social welfare counsellors. And these are some of the themes from the qualitative research. The overarching theme is one of uncertainty. And when you do any research amongst cancer survivors, they talk about uncertainty about their health. What was important here is the self-employed survivors also talk about the uncertainty to do with their business. The other themes that I'm going to talk about are cancer treatment and late effects, entrepreneurship, and business-related worries. So in terms of cancer treatment and late effects, the self-employed survivors spoke about how important it was that they knew what was going to happen and how much time it would take, because that information was crucial for them for planning and managing their business. They also spoke about being surprised about late effects, and again, cancer survivors often talk about this. But for the self-employed, this made it difficult for them to plan for the future. So here is a quote from one self-employed participant who talked about their workability being so low that they can't think about visions and plans for their company. In terms of entrepreneurship and engagement, the self-employed talk about business being their baby and they're motivated to work, and they're lucky because they can fit work around treatment. And they also say there are other benefits. It's not all negative, because having to work and being able to work because it's flexible, it also gives them a place where they're not a cancer patient, and that's a significant advantage. And then in terms of business-related worries, the survivors all talk about the challenge of keeping their business running and securing current and future income, and cancer making that responsibility even greater, leading to increased stress. One survivor said, "I've no time to be sick. Will I lose customers? Do I have to shut my business?" Their mind was just full of these uncertainties. Another one talked about just being sick of the entire thing, and he wished he was an ordinary employee, and then he could be allowed to be sick and not to have to worry about his business. I think you'll agree with me that many of these quotes are very powerful and really tell of that challenge of balancing the business with health. I'm going to talk a little bit about evidence gaps, and then I think I'll just move to conclusions. So what do we still not know? Well, I think what we do know about the self-employed is this tiny little green slice here. And here these are the things we think we don't know. And actually, there are so many things we just don't know we don't know. We don't know about, we really don't understand the impact of cancer on self-employed people and their businesses. Are these experiences different for different types of self-employment? Whether people have got employees or not, whether they have professional or manual jobs, whether they're their own business or they have a single client. We don't know anything about the factors that help and hinder work engagement after cancer for the self-employed. And we don't know what's a good work outcome for the self-employed. What are their preferences and their needs around work participation? We really don't understand how social security and social welfare provisions impact, other than we know they're important. What's key here is that this means that findings of studies may not be transferable from one country to another where the social welfare provisions are different. And really don't understand the wider implications of cancer on the working lives of the self-employed people. We really need to understand better workability, work-related quality of life, income and income security, impact on healthcare, impact on well-being and quality of life. And we don't understand how experiences of self-employed survivors compare to self-employed people with other chronic conditions. So there are a lot of challenges to doing research in this group, though. Just 3 of them to get you thinking. How do you systematically identify people who are self-employed? Sometimes there are groups and there are of self-employed, but most self-employed people don't belong to these groups. So how do you systematically find the self-employed to research them? For a self-employed individual, there's a significant opportunity cost to taking part in research. They could be working in their business if they're taking part in their research. And many of the questions that we would ask salaried survivors may not apply or be meaningful to the self-employed. So what do we need to do? Well, I think we need to bring all of our research tools to bear. We can think about what we might be able to do with registries and administrative data, and we're starting to find ways to link disease registry data with things like taxation records to be able to find and identify people who are self-employed and track their health outcomes. But we also need primary data collection. We need a lot of qualitative research to really understand people's experiences, as well as robust quantitative longitudinal research. I'm not going to talk to you about how we best support survivors because I'm conscious that I've talked for so long, and I'm going to move instead to some conclusions for you. Take-home messages. The self-employed are a growing population of considerable importance in many economies and societies. They may be at risk of poorer work-related outcomes, poorer health and quality of life than salaried survivors. The current available evidence is limited and important knowledge gaps remain. And we need to do robust research to better quantify the impact of cancer on self-employed people and to understand their experiences and preferences. And if we're thinking about interventions for self-employed survivors, they need to focus both on the work outcomes and on maintaining business, because if we simply focus on one and not the other, then this will be problematic. So I'm going to thank my colleagues and collaborators who've worked on these studies, both in the studies that I did in Ireland, internationally, and my colleagues in the CAN1 network. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Linda, for your compelling presentation. This is Lucy Kutsum here, member of the core research, cancer and work research team, professor at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Just a comment, the self-employed and small business owners make up a significant proportion of the workforce worldwide. And so this is a very important group for us to understand across professions, across disciplines. So we'll now turn to, we have a few minutes left for questions. We'll turn to questions. I also wanted to thank to everyone online tuning in with us. So we'll start the question and answer portion of the webinar. We have a question. What does the research tell you about common ways self-employed workers mitigate the challenges with coping with cancer treatment?
That's an interesting question. There's a little bit of information in the new study, the new qualitative study that I mentioned in Norway, and in a little bit of the qualitative work we also did in Ireland. And generally what people talk about is the importance of friends and family stepping in to help with the business to mitigate the effects. And sometimes in the Norwegian work, people talk about understanding and support from some of their clients. So those issues of kind of social support seem to be very important. The other thing that seems to be important is for survivors to be able to plan with their health professional and to understand the timing of what's going to happen with their treatment course, so they can think about using that to plan their work activities around about treatment.
Okay, very interesting. Relatedly, are you aware of what some individuals, who, self-employed who experienced cancer, what they did to compensate for the challenges? So were there some kind of compensatory that to help with the challenges that came with cancer diagnosis and treatment?
I'm not aware of anything in the research where people have looked at that, so I think that's probably a gap, and it would be useful for us to better understand that, because at the moment people just tell us about, you know, the things that I've mentioned where they had help from others and support from others, and in terms of other types of compensation, I think we don't really understand that well yet.
Okay. Another question, are you aware of any programs in place to prevent unwanted changes in work for cancer survivors?
Well, now I suppose actually, I guess you can think about it in terms, not particularly programs. There are a lot of interventions that have been tested, and there's legal protection in many countries now. So for example, in the European Union and in the United Kingdom, there's legal protection against discrimination in work, and what that says is not only that your employer can't discriminate against you because you have cancer, but also says that your employer is obliged to make reasonable accommodations. So those accommodations that you might welcome to help you cope after a diagnosis. Of course, that's for employees. The situation for those who are self-employed is, I guess, they really are dependent on themselves and trying to make those accommodations themselves, which may or may not be possible.
Right. I'm going to turn to our co-panelist, Maureen Parkinson. Perhaps you have, if you wanted to talk a bit about Canada.
Yeah, so I wanted to mention kind of exactly what you're speaking to. The Cancer and Work website lists in the resource section a number of support programs for people that are coping with challenges with working. There's a few cancer-specific ones out there, like, for example, BC Cancer Agency has a rehab program, and there's Wellspring, and there's SATB for the young, the childhood cancer survivors. But there's also various sort of employment programs for people that are coping with disabilities, and we have a list of that in the resource section. We also have kind of what I call the Coles Notes for human rights. So some links to places where people can get legal information about human rights, as well as a description about the human rights that exist in Canada, and various other, even some ideas developed by an occupational therapist about some job accommodation ideas, things that they can do to tweak their workplace or the work demands to allow them to work.
That sounds great, and I'm very conscious that there's similar supports in place in the United Kingdom. For example, Macmillan, the cancer charity, produce guidebooks and resources and have a helpline both for cancer survivors and to support employers. And it sounds very similar to the initiatives that you have in place.
Yeah, and very much so. We're kind of excited about our website because we do link to the best in the world, and that includes So we review what we have, and if we think that's relevant and helpful to Canadians, we will specifically link to those.
And again, that's cancerandwork.ca, the website. I have not a question, but a comment. So the participant is saying, absolutely magnificent presentation. I'm a business owner, self-employed, who was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2013. Fortunately, my physician, an oncologist and radiation physician, recognized my specific challenges and accommodated treatment times to assist in getting to clients while in treatment. I do totally relate to my business suffering because of inability to engage in vision and business development.
Yeah. Yes, the more work I do in this area, the more I hear stories, and it's great to hear about health professionals being accommodating and supportive, and I think actually that's one of the things that perhaps I should have had as a take-home message for anybody who's a health professional in this area, as I would like to encourage them to think about the situation that the self-employed are in, and anything that they can do as a health professional to be accommodating around about the times of treatment, and also to share what the longer term treatment plan can be, and the expectations of how quickly somebody might be able to get back to some kind of reasonable capacity and workability. And I think it's very important for all survivors, but I think it's particularly important for the self-employed to allow them to plan in that way.
And I wanted to say two things struck me during your presentation. One thing was the perhaps commonalities between the self-employed and those in precarious employment. So those with low income, those without benefits, those without sick leave.
Yes.
And I wonder what, in terms of from a researcher standpoint, when you were saying it's very important not to lump different workers into the groups, but would there be any, what value might you see in perhaps comparing these two groups of workers?
I think it would be really interesting to compare these two groups of workers, because I'm very conscious that the evidence base we have is not only largely about salaried survivors, it's largely from people with cancers like breast cancer and prostate cancer, and those are cancers which tend on average to occur in people of higher socioeconomic status, and actually we know a lot less about the outcomes of people who have more precarious jobs, who have lower socioeconomic status, who have cancers that tend to be associated with lower socioeconomic status. So in one of the other presentations I give, where I'm not focusing on the self-employed, I talk about the need to really understand these groups and the situation of those who don't have the type of job that I have, where I'm sure if I was diagnosed with cancer tomorrow, because I have so much control over my job, my employer would be likely very understanding and a lot of flexibility, but it's very different for other people who might work in my organisation and don't have those same advantages. And we really need to put a lot more research focus on understanding those who are not in such fortunate positions and in such secure jobs. And I think your idea of perhaps looking at those who are in precarious employment and the self-employed together is really quite an interesting one.
Okay. And I realize we're going a little over, but we have just another one more last question. We've gotten a few questions here, but I'll get this. I'll pose this last question. You had mentioned a European study, a strategy, one strategy in terms of the self-employed to deal with the cancer is to communicate with clients. But is it possible for you to expand a bit? Because there is also, on the other side, a reluctance to disclose.
Absolutely.
For fear that the self-employed, they'll lose clients.
Yes.
To that.
And I think that's absolutely right. And certainly both sides of this emerged from the qualitative interviews that in the Norwegian study. And once we have the paper in press, it'll be quite clear that some survivors did absolutely speak about the fact that their clients were often very understanding. But on the other hand, other survivors spoke about not wishing to disclose it because their business felt like so much part of them that they felt that they could not disclose that they had cancer in case it was a threat to their business. They could not disclose that their business was in difficulties because they had cancer, because that was not only about their business, that was a threat to their identity on the other hand. So I think that this is very much a one size does not fit all. And I guess that's somewhat true for salaried workers as well, because when I talk to salaried cancer survivors, some of them talk about being quite happy to disclose to their employers and their employers being understanding about their cancer. But others are very conscious that they don't want their employer to know because they do feel that their employer may well judge and discriminate against them because of it. So I really do think it's a one size fits all and doesn't fit all. And I really wouldn't want to recommend what people should do. It's about their circumstances and their comfort, I think.
Okay, thanks so much, Linda. Thanks for a great Q&A session to all the people tuning in too.
Thank you, Linda, for this fantastic presentation. Thank you, Maureen and Lucy, for moderating the webinar. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us.